Thank you, Simon, and thanks, Ben, for organising this, and thanks again, Dave, for the support. So what I want to do is sort of give you an understanding about basically the journey I've been on for probably the last decade, because this is really probably for me, it's actually been, it actually has been a decade. It's been about 2005 I started on this. And it's been a journey. And what I want to do is first sort of give you some understanding about some of the language we talk about. This is actually a boat Roaring 42, which I was navigating on in Cowswick in 2012. And it's a Sunday, it's a nice pleasant day. We're just running along Gurney, coming back to the finish line. The previous day had actually been pouring about 20 knots coming back in and powered up. But this was quite interesting because most 40s only have a keel depth of about 2 meters. This is an open 40. It's built basically for shorthanded blue water racing. It only just come back doing the Quebec-St. Malo, so it had been across the Atlantic. And it had a keel depth of 3 meters. So what it did is it redefined the boundaries of navigational water for me in the Solent. Because what you do when you're racing in the Solent, the mantra is basically if you don't touch, you're not trying hard enough. And we actually had another additional boundary that came into this, was basically, this boat was owned by Michel and his wife. And they left the boat in our hands on the Sunday night. And Michel, before she left, said, well, actually, left it with Richard, who's driving at this point in time, and I'm just trimming. And she said, actually, Richard, you realize all our livelihood is tied up in this boat? Please don't basically do anything, damage it this week. So that brought an additional constraint to bear on it. It meant basically we weren't going to be touching the ground anywhere during the week. The reason I just wanted to talk about this was this talks about basically boundaries, constraints. All boundaries are constraints, but not all constraints are boundaries, which is a slight play on Greg Brougham. All architecture is design, but not all design is actually architecture. And something else we talk about from a complexity point of view is basically around systems being dispositional. This is Pierre Simon Laplace in the 1800s, which is probably the predominant view really for the last couple of hundred years. It's a very mechanistic view that basically if we actually have better models and more computational power, we should be able to predict the future. And if you've read Ralph Stacey in his last book, had a very interesting sort of story in the back. He talked about actually how he had come about, ended up in complexity. And he was very much of this view when he started out doing his PhD, came out of it was the models were just insufficient. What we need is better models, more computational power, and we'd be able to predict it. But in a complex system, the agents basically interact. We talk about basically the behavior being emergent, it's dispositional in nature. So the agents may actually be predisposed to behave in a certain way, but the system we can't predict. And this is the tweet before the All Blacks France game in Cardiff. And if you know anything basically about the history of rugby, the last time they played in Cardiff, the French kicked the All Blacks actually out of the World Cup. And what was interesting coming into this, the All Blacks actually hadn't played very well in the pool games in the World Cup. There was a question mark over basically how they were going to compete on the field on the Friday evening. And what had happened in the French we knew were in strife again. The coach was on the way out. There was talk basically about mutiny within inside the team. We didn't know which French team was going to turn up. So it made it rather interesting as a New Zealander going into this, saying, well, actually, we might actually not win this one tonight. As it was, it actually turned out to be a very interesting game, and New Zealand won and moved through. And part of this was about basically what I've sort of just talked about was the language, and this really came about. And this is all about basically trying to find more obscure references than what Dave can find. This one I only came across in the last couple of days, but it really encapsulated what I want to talk about was the fact that basically thought determines language, they're intervolved. This is Vygotsky very much. And this came about because I had a friend, Chris, he ended up basically on a chain with, not this Chris, with Elisa Giro, and she sent us out this link about network controlology, and it was about applying complexity theory to network control and recovery. And I got this email saying, well, actually, have you got a primer on complexity theory? Because I've read this and I don't really actually understand that. And this is one of the problems I've actually faced in the last sort of 5 years, was the terminology, and I might have probably benefited from putting a glossary actually in the book, but it's not there. And one of the reasons, I said the book was an introduction. Really what I've tried to do is avoid using the terminology. It's a bridge actually into some of that. At some stage you really have to actually deal with the language, and that basically changes your thought processes. And this is very much what I liked about embracing complexity. There's a great line in there, once you get it, it's very hard to unget it, you don't unget it. But I'm sort of leaping forward. Really what I want to talk about was the journey. So I've given you a touch for this. And this is about, for us, having new eyes. And for me, this sort of goes back to about 2005. I'd been asked to go and sort a large program out. It was to do with card settlement system for a pan-European card settlement system. And the only thing you can guarantee out of these is that you're going to have 12 to 18 months of your life is just going to be a shit, putting it back on track. Because it's typically not the technology, it's the people are the problems around a lot of this stuff. And what I found was basically we'd ended up with a system which the customer wanted an event-driven system. The target owners, performance characteristics went to owners, so it only had to be about 5,000 TPS in the clearing engine. But they wanted it event-driven, so they built an architecture was event-driven. And then how do we exercise this component? Oh, we'll write a servlet that injects an event. Right, how do we exercise this component? Oh, we'll write another servlet. Ooh, okay, so how do we actually coordinate all this stuff? Well, more importantly, actually, how do we stop and start it, and how do we recover it to meet the requirements of the customer? And we spent 12 months effectively doing what I referred to at the time doing open heart surgery. We had to rip it apart, put it all back together, build a scheduler that actually enabled us to stop, start, recover the system. And that wasn't a really pleasant experience. And what I found was there was a lot of really bright people working for this company. One guy had actually reverse engineered the Nintendo. He'd actually, from specification for the video card, written Java that simulated it. So you could effectively load a Nintendo game onto his Java application and it would actually run it complete with all the screen rendering. So it was one of those bifurcational moments. I could either continue to do this for the rest of my life, it wasn't the first recovery I'd done, or I could actually go and look at basically how do you do delivery. And I decided, well, actually, maybe I should go and see if there was actually a better way of doing system delivery. And this has involved a little bit of reading over the last few years. This was just the back shelf. Yeah, you picked up on it up here. So Chris is responsible for those. Those are the signed copies, which I haven't distributed. According to Amazon, I apparently have 14 Kindle devices and something like 200 books on my Kindle devices. So this is the overflow. And there's actually some interesting stuff here. Like this is Stephen Heckel's book, Adaptive Enterprises, which I don't know if you've actually ever read it. But the sense respond dementia in Cynefin came from Stephen. You can ask Dave about that story sometime.
You're actually telling him he was wrong when he produced it.
And one of the first things I actually went back and started reading was actually about theory of constraints. And the story for this was basically I was working with a guy, Robin Geddes, on a clearing system for the UK in the early 2000s. And his brother Martin worked with this guy called David Anderson. And David had just written this book on applying theory of constraints to software delivery. So I went back, and it was actually one of my first ports of call actually looking at this. And I also had a New Zealand friend, Clark Ching, who was heavily into theory of constraints, and he provided the bridge to meet David. And I actually ended up being one of the reviewers for the Cataman book when it came out. And theory of constraints I find interesting. It comes from a manufacturing paradigm. Although it has CCPM in there, critical chain project management, I don't find this actually particularly useful. I take things like the focusing steps out of it and the evaporating clouds, but the rest of it, I really don't find it very interesting. Although we've got some friends, Kevin Burr and the Praxis Flow guys use it heavily. They do, you do current reality trees, you do future reality trees, you do transformation trees. It's a heavily, very prescriptive process. I think one of the challenges I see with that is now with Goldrat's death is actually how do they actually continue to evolve as a technology. The only thing that's been quite interesting around this was, if you've read Alex Knight's Joy and Pride, which is effectively re-envisaging probably a theory of constraints for the 21st century. And that's actually quite engaging. I do like Kelvin Youngman's work that he's done. Kelvin's done some nice work on generic clouds, but the problem is it's locked behind the TOC firewall. And I mentioned David, and this is the scheduling algorithm, drum buffer rope, that he was in the early 2000s trying to apply to software delivery. And this is a production process. It was also about 2006, 6, that Don Ramazan had gone to Dave and said, actually, you've got all the basis of actually a Cataman thing. And Dave went, yay, I don't have to explain drum buffer rope, because this looks very, very simple, but trying to get your head around some of this stuff, this is actually not easy. And it's actually quite interesting what Goldrat was doing with this in the 1980s. What he'd found was ERP had been rolled out across America. It didn't work because really what it was about was microcontrol and balance lines, and they just don't exist. That's fairyland, that's cuckoo cuckoo land. What Goldratt had realized was basically if you have your ERP system up here, instead of producing basically detailed schedules for each of the workstations, you could effectively just use this constraint for the ERP system to gate the stuff in and just let it through for the system. And then you could sit back and let the money roll in. And that's largely how he actually how he actually lived. He made a hell of a lot of money out of just effectively hacking ERP systems in the 80s. But if you're doing production and you really want to improve your production process, this is much quicker than Cataban. And it's actually, if you've seen Clark Ching's talk from Lean Agile Scotland a few weeks ago, he has the Buffalo story, which he uses to engage software delivery teams around this. It's still not bad, and I use some of the focusing steps when doing performance testing. You can't talk about this without sort of talking about Deming. Chris did tell me I had too many slides on system thinking in this, but I still want to talk about these because Deming is quite an interesting character. This was out of crisis, and of course he wrote out of crisis in the 80s basically as frustration about the Americans, because the Americans actually knew how to do all this stuff in the 50s and in the World War II, but they lost that skill set. It was the Japanese that picked up on it, and Toyota specifically. Toyota basically picked up on the fact that the fulfillment process from retail propositions gave them the just in time, and along with statistical process control basically led to a lot of the stuff. I felt a lot of Deming stuff was really recutting the 1920s, the Stewart concept of PDCA and that. And I utilize statistical process control, but I don't use Six Sigma. One of the big things that I actually found one of the more interesting reads around this was basically Nice, the Deming dimension, where he talks about basically Six Sigma and typical process optimization. And you have the concept of process capability, which talks about basically variance of process versus specification. Ultimately, what you want is the variance basically to be very, very little against the specification. That leads to an optimized state. If you're familiar with Takeuchi loss functions. And what he stresses, Nice pointed out, was the fact that Six Sigma would actually result in a process that actually was about 5 times less capable than actually one which has been optimized with optimized. So the Americans basically had the wrong, Six Sigma is just the wrong measure system. It doesn't really result in an outcome you want. And I think that's something which is actually being to the detriment of the industry as a whole. The thing about Six Sigma coming in, you're probably aware Lloyd's, the previous CEO actually brought it in and tried to put Six Sigma across the organization. And that was effectively just a shambolic process. It was quite interesting when the new CEO came in, the behavioral changes when they actually threw a lot of that crap out and started to become focused on the customer and just not the processes again. I did a lot of reading around INO. The reason I put this book up, this is the book that John Sook recommends. And John's an interesting character. And I think there is a lot of stuff actually in Lean, but Lean is well misunderstood and has been abused in the last 30 years. There's now some stuff coming out that basically what Tashione basically did is misled the West. It was about the flow, it was about his river system, its flow system. It wasn't about waste at all. And I was amused, one of the first Cognitive Edge course I did in 2012, there was actually someone on the course, and what they had a small consultancy in the Benelux countries, and what they had found this little niche. Their niche was actually going and fixing the companies that are being leaned by a certain consultancy which started with M. It doesn't, going after flow has value, going after waste has no value, basically. It's quite paradoxical. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. I like Alan Ward's stuff, which Michael Kennedy's picked up and actually followed through on. Unfortunately, Ward died quite early. Kennedy's basically published 2 books. And the interesting thing about Kennedy's book, the second one is a certain company called Fisher & Paykel. Fisher & Paykel is the main white goods manufacturer in New Zealand, and a good friend of mine, David Sullivan, who Wendy knows quite well, is the CFO of Fisher & Paykel. So it was actually, I was able to go and have a coffee with him sometime when I was, a couple of years ago when I was visiting New Zealand, sit down and compare notes about what they had actually done. And I think there's also some quite interesting stuff in his work around basically around knowledge management and trade-off curves and stuff like that. But a lot of that stuff is not really out there. There's very little material around some of that stuff. There's This is Lean is also quite a good introduction. It's starting to think about actually what Lean actually is as a value proposition. And the book that John shook when he was asked what book you would have liked to have written is Johnson and Brougham's Beyond Profit. And that's well worth reading as well. That's a really good book. And this got me to about 2010. I was doing an engagement in Tel Aviv for a payments company. And what they wanted to do was completely re-envision their delivery process from the customer engagement through basically the requirements through delivery to the through to the support. And at this stage, I was still very much in the systems thinking mentality. Basically, what I was looking at was Checkman's soft system methodology versus Acroft idealized design. And I ended up using Acroft's approach. And I think Acroft was one of those people who was probably getting there with a little bit of complexity. I love a story about, has anyone heard the story about basically why, his story about why we drive, the French drive on the right and we drive on the left?
They're stupid.
Interesting.
It's got nothing to do with that. You know, what he talked about was, and they may be stupid or separate discussion, was that he talked about synergy versus before analysis. And what he talked about was if you sit back and you will actually look at the wider context to establish why these things work. And it turns out the English drive on the left, because basically it was all about the fact that the knights in the medieval times basically were predominantly right-handed, so they drew their board, they sort of crossed their body like that. Therefore, when they rode on the left-hand side of the road, and that just carried through in terms of basically the horses and when the vehicles came along. Now, the interesting one was, of course, where actually you talk about actually why were the French basically on the right. It turns out Napoleon was left-handed and basically mandated that his troops actually walk on the opposite side of the road. He would walk on the right, therefore his troops had to walk on the left. And that followed through basically. So, you know, he talks about the fact that taking a vehicle apart, doing an analysis of it, doesn't allow you to understand. You must actually understand the context around this. And I think when I sort of reflected on some of this, this is Sloan's talk about basically how he sorted the production lines out for GM in the sort of early times when they started to come along. And if you looked at Rumfeld's Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, he talks about this in the end. Basically, when GM went bankrupt, there was no alignment. There was huge overlaps. They were effectively cannibalizing themselves in terms of the product lines. And this is where I find a lot of organizations, you have P&L lines, they don't necessarily have clear demarcation. They're not working basically for each other. You know, and I think the classic example here is, was it Red Bull 2011, where they compromised on the core and the engine basically to improve the efficiency of the overall package, and that allowed them to be a predominant provider. But also, you know, to my mind, it's actually one of the reasons why you don't want to list the gardener and the analyst, because really what they have is the quadrants. They have the products basically in the top right. What you want, you listen to your purchase department. What you want to do is buy the best product. That's the best product in that niche. That doesn't mean to say it's the best product for you. What you want actually to be able to do is bring together products which meet your requirements, which actually you can get to market quickly to realize value. That's a completely different proposition. That's not what the analysts are telling you. And I've just seen that go pear-shaped so many times. And this sort of started, there was a lot of reading. You know, the key thing about this is I've portrayed this as a slightly linear process. It wasn't linear. I find that basically I read something, I'll find something of interest, I'll go off and read it, and maybe a few months later I'll come back and continue on that theme. It's all about basically diversity and trying to gather some ideas. On the left, John Boyd, Maneuver Warfare, OODA loops, which are anything other than loops, they're not loops. He's really quite interesting to read. I think is the book on which he wrote as a PhD on Boyd. And he was, I think, starting to get complexity. This goes back to 1976, Disruption Construction, when he was talking about you must actually deconstruct things to be able to construct again, to actually move the organization forward. There's probably 3 books. Chet Ridges was actually quite interesting. Chet Ridges was talking at Lean Kanban Central Europe last week. And it's worth watching his talk as well, because he's sort of talking about a lot of basically the ideas behind maneuver warfare and some of these ideas. And the other one, as I just mentioned, Fernando Flores, because he's quite an interesting character. He's done some quite interesting work, but his paper's not widely available. I was quite fortunate because I had someone who'd worked for one of the companies that had an IP. So I actually had a lot of his personal papers to read. In the last year, one of his daughters has pulled his papers together and actually published them. And those are worth reading, because I find those quite useful in terms of things like role descriptions, moving away from task to more outcome satisfaction-based criteria. So you can see as we went through this, really what I was doing was building up a little bit of a toolkit, really, things that actually had value. What I was finding was basically what I wanted, my gut feeling was it couldn't be a participant, it needed to be a participant in nature, and it needed to be basically something which actually was more descriptive. And that sort of 2011 was the first email exchange I had with Dave, and I didn't do a Cognitive Edge course the following year. These are two photos from Lean UX in the beginning of this year. And I've got Alicia and Dave up because I feel sometimes the boundary between these is actually quite arbitrary. And one of the things that really I liked about the work Dave was doing around Cynefin was basically the fact that it was about bounded applicability. It wasn't talking about all that stuff, shit and throw it out. It was talking about it has applicability over here, realize it doesn't have applicability here. So it's very much about building on that and actually starting to come up with some practices. There are other people in the complexity space, I feel, who have taken the view it's complex, therefore we can't do anything. You know, there is actually things you can actually do in that system. I should actually mention that actually that was in Brooklyn. That was the entrance. One of the reasons I'd gone over was basically John Shook was talking. It was an opportunity to talk to John, talk to him. And we're standing at the back of the thing, just had Portaloo, it was Will Evans's conference, and had Portaloos at the back, and we had to move as the toilet started overflowing. David left by that stage. And Alicia Giro was also talking. And Alicia, of course, has brought us dynamics in action, all the stuff around context-sensitive, context-free and context-sensitive constraints. This allows us to start thinking about change in a completely different way. And the other thing is the language about safe to fail, fail to safe. And I think that is actually starting to actually have some quite interesting things around scalability. But I think we've actually approached scalability as an industry in the wrong way around this. And that's led to some interesting conversations in the background with Ross Miles and Adrian Cochran about microservices. Because the challenge you have with microservices is really about, you're moving the argument from robustness to resilience. And true resilience is about acknowledging failure and how do you actually then behave. So I find this stuff really quite relevant to really what I do on a day-to-day basis and quite useful. Just a little bit on Cynefin. Most people have seen this. Most people also get, there was actually a footnote in the book which actually talked about Spencer Brown, which I was quite amused. Only about one person actually emailed me back about that. And I probably could have used Spencer Brown, who wrote Laws of Form. The other one would have been Noose to Real Numbers. Both of them start by actually drawing a line in the sand, establishing a boundary, and that allows them to develop the calculus. And that's really what I was coming up with this. This is about drawing a line and saying, well, actually, it's ordered, unordered, and then you evolve the model actually from that. And a lot of people also get hung up around the fact that categorization versus contextualization. I believe you can use this for single instance categorization. Liz has a code red. Capability red, which is really effective in this space. It's looking at about where actually do you sit in here, how do you behave. Kim has her questions she uses for the project manager at Telstra in Australia, and Jake Bloom's sort of blogged about this as well. You can categorize this, but you need to be careful about actually how to get it. And what you really should be doing is bringing the narrative out of the organization to enable them to understand where they actually are. Where I think the real value starts to come is when you start talking about contextualization, and narrative comes in a moment. And this is where you actually, the data precedes the framework. And this is the real, starts to become quite interesting, because really what you're looking at is this is a sense-making process. You've got a lot of issues, a lot of problems. What you're looking at is the cognitive engagement. It's not, it's simple, it's ordered. It's basically, it might be a little bit, we need to go and ask someone, so it's therefore it's not obvious, but it's not, we don't have competing hypotheses, so it's probably on the right versus the left. And this enables you then to basically start understanding and making sense of a situation around this. But I think the real value sort of comes out of the Cynefin cognitive edge practices is really around the narrative aspects of this. And I do love this quote. And it was quite interesting. There was, during the World Cup, there was actually an interview with Conrad Smith. And what it transpires is you probably, a lot of the press coverage during the World Cup was around the All Blacks being probably the most professional rugby sports team of all time. Turns out their culture is completely oral. They don't write. They have no written culture internally within the All Blacks. If someone coming in, they're expected to perform, they want to understand how to perform, talk to people, work it out. It's all basically an evolutionary process. They don't have anything written down. And it strikes me as a complete contrast with most organisations you walk into where it's values. You know, this is our culture. It's defined by our values and our beliefs, and it's like, ugh, bollocks. And this is, I think, the secret sauce stuff. You know, and I still, this is the stuff I'm starting to get real value actually out of. And what I find a lot these days is it tends to be basically a very anthropological, based approach. I'll listen very carefully to the language. It's about immersion in the environment. And it's very much basically about understanding what their problems are and actually then starting to come up with this. I like this because this is one of the original cognitive edge engagements where they're doing Children of the World. You can see a little fragment. And the key thing about this was this basically supports disintermediation. They've talked about what happens in their context. They're self-signifying it, and that allows you then to develop a fitness landscape. And the fitness landscape then allows you to look at basically propensity, change, who's telling similar stories and start to evolve and understand what the patterns are. Because this is really about basically using human cognition to actually understand the patterns. And one of the last things I wanted to close with was really talking about how I've also started to use this. This was actually came out of a little debate with Jay Bloom a few weeks ago. It went on for an hour on DM after we finished it on Twitter about exploration versus planning. And this is actually the routing from a race earlier this year. This was the first offshore we did, although it was actually a longshore. Royal Southampton qualified it as an offshore, so we had to put a life raft on it. And it's about 48 miles, and the routing was about 5 hours 28 for us. And typical English weather, although the predicted, the routing basically had us about 20 knots of breeze. When we got out there, it was 30 knots, and we saw about 35 knots coming across the bay here. Unfortunately, what happened is when we were going across the end here, we were still doing 14 knots, and the beach is just there. In which case, Brian basically, we actually broached out because he got rather concerned about how close we got to the beach. It was also at that stage he realised he hadn't put the safety knife back on board. So he fortunately found a pair of scissors and hacked the tack line so we could get the boat actually up. At one stage, I was flat in the water. I had a boot full of water, which I was highly pissed off about. But we recovered it. And if I look at this is, if you've done your RYO Yacht Masters, this is typically how you lay a course out. You have a start, you have your waypoints, and you have a finish. And what I've started doing now is actually thinking, it came out of a discussion with Campbell Fell when he was doing the Fastnet briefings earlier this year for Rourke. What I start to do now is basically I'll put the start in, I'll put the finish in, I may put a few exclusion zones in, but I won't constrain the routing. And this package is Expedition, which is basically Nick White's navigation software. It's one of the pieces of software they use on the Volvos. And going into a race about 5 days out, when the weather grids start coming out, I'll effectively iterate over the process on a daily basis. I'll look at actually how the weather patterns and the tidal patterns are evolving, and I won't constrain the routing. What I'm looking for is basically how it's actually evolving over time. Now, if I turn up on the boat and say we've got a start and a finish, and we might be going this way, of course the crew's not going to engage and the skipper's not going to invite me back. So what I find is basically I use it for exploration, and as we come into the events, what I'll do is I'll put in the clearing points. No, these waypoints are set basically so they're in about 4 or 5 meters of water that are sufficiently far off the headlands that we're not going to have a problem. Those go in, and then when this effectively gets printed out, this becomes the briefing sheet for the crew, and therefore we can engage in a meaningful conversation. But it's about not over-constraining. It's about understanding how you flex the constraints to allow exploration versus basically exploitation around that. And finally, just coming back to the book, this should have been quite an ordered process. What actually happened is I wrote a series of articles for InfoQ, 101 articles, and then Shane Hussey said, you've got the basis of a mini book. So went through that process. That actually had a few hiccups. If you've ever, they went off and wanted to copy edit, and I'd actually engaged someone to do some freelance copy editing. I thought this is fine, it should be okay. They sent it off to a professor of journalism in Toronto, and it came back very red. And organising this actually, I thought was going to be quite straightforward, but we had a slight problem on communication at one stage. It was all just about linear. It was very, very ordered. I was having an exchange with Dave, and then basically one stage was trying to basically organise this for a walk. That all went pear-shaped, and then Steinman sent a tweet out about this. Dave retweeted it, but I suspected Dave actually hadn't read it, and I thought, I'm in a chaotic state. This is not good. And you can either then act or you choose not to act. And I chose, well, actually, maybe I'll just leave this for a week. Dave will get around to probably coming back to me in a week when he's come back, when he stopped his travels. And he came back to me a week later, and it all came back on track. And it started to become moved into an audit space problem again. So that's all I really wanted to talk about. So hopefully there's some copies of the book if you want them. And Dave is happy to answer, to join me and answer any questions.
Thank you.
We're all looking at you, Chris. You got a mouthful.
Are there any further iterations or developments of this plan?
No, one of the reasons of doing it as an ebook was basically what they said was if there was additional things that could be added, they could be added at more or less incremental cost. In fact, what's in the book is actually not all the papers. There was actually a couple others I wrote which didn't really make it, weren't in a reasonable state. They exist in a note form which would need a bit more work, and because of the time scales they didn't cut. And of course, Dave's got his book coming too.
Yeah, it's only 6 years overdue. The publisher has been quite nice, really.
Liz, nothing?
Any other questions on Cynefin or what?
I have a question.
You may have a mic, sir.
So, Greg, why is it called Cynefin?
I said Dave, that was for Dave to write in his book.
Okay.
I mean, I'll answer it if you want. It was.
Mike?
I've got a mic on.
No, that's for recording. That's for the.
Sorry?
That's for recording. That's for the public.
Yeah, it was actually, I was asked to do a debate with Nanaka. I mean, I've encountered Nanaka twice in my life, once in knowledge management and once in Agile, and both times in opposition. So Nanaka produced a 2x2 matrix. And the great irony is he wrote a book which said Westerners think in categorization terms and Easterners don't, which is actually wrong. But then he produced one of the worst categorization models in the history of humanity. So it was kind of like, So he had the tacit explicit 2x2 matrix. And I was one of the first people to challenge that. Now everybody challenges it, but back in 95, very few people did. And the University of Lyon invited us to do a debate. So there was myself, Peter Checkland, Nanaka, and Richard McDermott, who was kind of like a little bit isolated by that, right? And just before we went for the debate, Nanaka republished his framework and called it BAR. So it used to be called SECI. Yeah, socialization, externalization, internalization. And then he recalled it BAR, which is a Japanese word with profound spiritual significance, which means place. So I know what's going on, right? Yeah, Nanaka-san, great Japanese thinker, creates model with Japanese name with spiritual significance, I'm dead. So I phoned up Sharon and said, Sharon, what's the Welsh equivalent of BAR? And she said, Cynefin. So now Welsh academic creates Welsh model with Welsh name with deep spiritual significance, and that's actually why it was called Cynefin, right? But it's proved very useful since, right? But that is the true origin of it.
Yeah.
Thanks. My name's Dean, Scrum Master, currently contracting at the Telegraph. At the Telegraph, we tend to adopt the traditional kind of Scrum framework. So we have a planning session, we develop for 2 weeks, and we demo as and when things are ready for demoing, and then we have a review session where we have the stakeholders, the traditional kind of Scrum process. We do have opportunities to explore stuff during the sprint, but it's kind of perhaps a bit weak. We just identify things that might need spiking, and then we go back and then by new learning, put proper story points in the story once that learning is finished. But I'm interested in how we could integrate Cynefin into the traditional Scrum process, perhaps identifying in what quadrant something falls in. I'm not sure if anyone here, or perhaps you have thoughts on that?
Yep.
There's also Jim Benson one I love was basically it's people over process, unless it's Scrum, in which case it's process over people.
First of all, you can't have a model with 5 domains and call them quadrants, right? I mean, it's a common error, right? Scrum as a technique in Cynefin terms is a complex to complicated transition technique. And there are 2 major mistakes people make with Cynefin. One is they think chaos is a permanent state, when actually chaos is always a temporary state. And that's actually really important, right? Because you can't have a system without constraints for any sustainable period of time. Right? So Cynefin, a lot of people confuse it, but that's one thing. The other kind of like major mistake is to forget that the most important thing about Cynefin is the dynamics. You categorize by domain and by dynamic. Yeah, so that's shifting between domains. So what Scrum does is Scrum is a linear iterative process. Therefore, a priori, it cannot be a complex systems technique. Yeah, it's a complex to complicated transition technique. Yeah. Now, some of the new stuff we're doing on project management and user design, we're taking a radical new approach to user requirements capture, which gets rid of systems analysts. Yeah, which I've always had an ambition to do because I never trusted a systems analyst in the first place. In which you get continuous capture of day-to-day narratives from users as they form clusters on fitness landscapes, which is a visual technique. You can allocate a pair programming technique. I think we lost a lot in XP with Agile, and I think there's a lot of XP techniques we need to bring back. You put a pair programming team for 3 days to see if they can produce something which users want. The things which come out of that then go into Scrum. Yeah, so we're extensively, and we'll be teaching this next week, a whole body of techniques which I'm calling pre-Scrum within Agile. Yeah, because the essence of complexity is parallel, contradictory experiments to see what's actually viable. By the time you hit a Scrum process, you've already decided something is viable and you're trying to iterate it to get it there. Yeah? So I think that's one of the key principles. The other big thing which we'll announce shortly, is actually recognising there's nothing wrong with waterfall. I mean, you see this with Telstra. I mean, I still amuse. I did a whole around Australia trip on complexity, and I met these guys from Telstra, and they said, "Well, we've got waterfall projects, but we're not allowed to do waterfall anymore because everything's got to be agile. So we created 1-year sprints." Now, I thought that was brilliant, right? Kind of like, okay, you guys want to play these stupid corporate games, all right? And they're doing the same with SAFE at the moment, don't talk about trains, right? But one of the interesting things in that, and this is when we're now starting to move on project management, is you need to move from parallel safe to fail iteration into Scrum. And everybody's forgotten the value of time boxes. Go back to the DSDM method. I was one of the 3 founders on DSDM way back. Yeah? There's nothing wrong with a 6-month time box if you've got a level of definition which allows it. And there's nothing wrong with waterfall. So we're now going to start to produce actually a comprehensive approach to project management, which actually says Scrum is a part of the process, not the whole of the process.
Okay, thank you. Just to let you know, the Telegraph has adopted SAFE and Scrum religiously as well. So.
Well, if you want to, never mind. All right. Personally, that if the Tory graph goes under because of adoption of wrong techniques, I will have no problem.
So Dave, I hear that you're a real advocate of SAFE. Can you tell us what its positive points are, please?
It's a good way of Dean earning money for nothing. I mean, any technique by which, after you've gone on a 5-day course, you can then teach a 2-day course, provided you pay the inventor money, basically tells you what it's about. Yeah, it's basically a revenue-generating device. And Dean learnt the lesson from this first failure, which actually is to say you don't have to adopt it, provided you say you're adopting it. You only pick the bits which work for you. Therefore, you can sustain success. Right? And anybody who understands complexity, the minute you look at that SAFe diagram, you say, it's got it wrong. Yeah? Because everything is defined, everything is in a structured flow. Yeah, it's basically, it could destroy Agile. Yeah? Because what it does is it makes Agile acceptable to managers who don't want to be Agile but want to pretend they're being, by putting excessive structure into the system. I mean, it's total crap. Yeah. It's very well marketed crap.
That was the positive statement I thought.
Yeah, well, it's actually interesting. If you blog against it, what you find is Dean won't come out and play. I mean, several of us have challenged Dean to debates, and he won't come out and play. What you get is this troop of people come in and hit you. Yeah, and they've all got the same line. You don't like this because we're taking training revenue off Scrum. Right? Now, Ken is vulnerable to that. My attack on it is it's a priori wrong. It's wrong because it doesn't understand the nature of system. It's actually creating an ordered system in a complex world.
I have a question.
Just a follow-up to the comment on waterfall. Okay, so if you're in the complex domain, how do you feel about waterfall then?
At this stage, well, you wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
I mean, the essence of a complex domain is you don't yet know what's possible.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is also why Scrum doesn't work there either, because Scrum assumes a degree of, in fact, let me just be, I'm going to be deliberately extreme. IT people don't like dealing with users. Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, I was in IT all my life, all right? And the problem is users never knew what they wanted till we gave it them, and then they wanted something different anyway, all right? I mean, that was a traditional problem. So IT people tend to like to stop engagement with users, and Scrum does the same thing. Yeah, it doesn't allow the users to be engaged in the design process. It basically puts them into blocks at the start and the end. So it's like a mini waterfall. Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's huge value. What we're starting to do is say you have to engage users in radically different ways. So I'll give you another example of a pre-Scrum technique. This is something I created for DSDM, and we're bringing back in at the moment. We would put users together with a small number of programmers for 8 hours and develop a prototype. Then we pass the prototype on to another group of programmers who are on an 8-hour time lag and get them to improve it. Then they would pass it on to another group of programmers on another 8-hour time lag, and they would improve it. Then it would come back and the users would look at it. And that was a brilliant technique. It was kind of like Chinese whispers. Yeah. Because basically, and I now understand the theory behind it, I didn't when I created it, we're creating a system with imperfect copying. Therefore, what comes back is probably going to create novelty which wouldn't have been designed in the first place. And I could take you through some others, but those are the sort of things we're now starting to do. And that's huge amounts of intimacy between a small group of programmers and a small group of users, yeah, rather than separating them into a structured process. And one of the big problems with Scrum is it still uses manufacturing metaphors. Scrum and Kanban still assume they're manufacturing software, and they haven't realized yet software these days is a service concept, not a manufacturing concept.
And just on a follow-up to that comment, so the enterprise services planning that David Anderson's talking about at the moment, he's kind of going the services-oriented direction. How do you feel about that?
I keep trying to work with David on a complexity-based Kanban. I mean, we've already worked out the basic principles of it, but tying David down is difficult. I think a complexity-based Kanban will be a fitness landscape of potentialities. It will be a probability distribution, not a structured flow. Now, I think that's actually, and this is, you need to wait for about a year on this, is one of the big areas I'm working on at the moment, is a new approach to software architecture based on complexity. Because at the moment, the architects are either arguing for or against TOGAF. Yeah, but everybody who's against TOGAF produces pictures which are just like TOGAF. Yeah, they got boxes and arrows. So I'm looking at fitness landscapes and probability distributions in the context of Kanban and architecture, and that involves going back to object orientation. So I think we need to create something in which applications emerge from interaction of people with software objects over time and then get stabilized. Yeah, and that's where Scrum will come in. Scrum will be the stabilization of emergent properties of interaction between people and software. And that's where the web's going anyway.
Thank you very much.
You could also look at...
Talk to you about that, and probably Dan Norfolk as well. Thank you.
Cool.
And
And
you could probably also look at Patrick Stewart's work.
just don't get me talking with Dan about religion, all right? But yeah, other than that, I'm happy, all right? But,
Patrick Stewart's got this concept around exploitation, explorative Kanban, so it's the pre-process that you drive actually into that. And I should have actually mentioned that because a lot of what I talked about was John Buffer, Robe and Kanban, of course, they come from the production process. They don't come from the development process. The development process in Toyota is set-based concurrent engineering, is how Ward qualified it. And it's quite interesting. We're using manufacturing paradigms actually for something which we're actually now acknowledging is not necessarily a manufacturing problem. Yeah. So you had a question?
Yeah. I'll try to formulate a question out of this. So you're saying with Scrum, it's actually, Scrum is there to transition you from, help you transition from complex into complicated. Yeah. And if you look at how many, I guess, organizations have, they're not really comfortable with Agile because they don't want to admit that there is such a place. They just pretend that they are. It is complicated, and they just try to move in there. You're talking about other techniques, better techniques than Scrums to actually deploy when you're in the complex?
no, I'm talking about complementary techniques. I think the issue is to understand where techniques sit. And the danger is, one of the problems you've got is people have got into this one domain is better than another. So, you know, my technique is complex, yours is complicated, right? You're an inferior class of being. And you've got this one bloody nutter who's now decided he works in the chaos space. And he's a wizard and everybody else is inadequate. I mean, only a software architect could come up with something that stupid. So the essence is to realize that different domains and different dynamics all have value and they're all actually equally valuable provided you get them right. So actually transitionary techniques are as important as domain-specific techniques. Yeah?
Is there value of remaining in the complex space?
Yeah.
And are there specific reasons to do that?
Yeah,
guidelines of when to do it? And
we just produced a new dynamic on Cynefin. So the standard 3 dynamics on Cynefin were complex to complicated iteration. And people always forget to come back. You know, once they've gone across, they think they're stable. Actually, if the environment changes, you need to move back. So that's the one dynamic. Then there's the switch down to best practice, which is waterfall. So if you're absolutely certain you're not going to have to change for 2 or 3 years, you can move it into that domain. And then there was a reset domain called a shallow dive into chaos. You've allowed things to become ossified. You've got to reset. I put a new one in last year called the grazing dynamic, in which something never actually ever really leaves complex. It's complex, complicated boundary, yeah, complex, chaotic boundary. So it's continuously moving in that domain. Now, in business strategy terms, we're seeing more of that. I mean, the finance sector is in a, I'm doing work with the financial services industry at the moment, it's in a permanent grazing dynamic. Nothing stabilizes for long enough to even become complicated. Yeah? Now, my argument is we need to move a significant amount of software into that space.
Really?
Yeah. And that's where you start to change it. So that's why we need to go back and I remember on the Corba committees when I sat on them back in the 80s and 90s, I was arguing that people need to be considered as objects as well as code. And we need to see object orientation as an architectural issue, not a reuse issue. And people got that wrong, I think, right? So I'm going back to that at the moment, I need to update myself on it. But what you need to do is where can you stabilize things, complicated things, which have enough stability, but how do you define the interactions between those things? So the interactions create dynamic flexibility. And what's the right granularity for a software object? Because a key principle in complexity is granularity. Yeah? Now that becomes quite exciting because it allows you to create systems where you can stabilize elements and stabilize interactions, but then systems can radically change very quickly without the need for comprehensive redesign. But I say I'll sell them to the Guardian, but not to the Telegraph. Sorry, you're not going to get one.
So I also have this slide or similar sort of, but immediately after that, I show the Stacy diagram. and they use often the same terms. What's the relationship between the two?
Virtually zero. I mean, I think there's 4 or 5 of us who actually use similar terms, but we come from a different base. So from Stacey's point of view, Stacey is basically rehabilitated Mead's theory of communication. That's where he comes from. And remember, Ralph was an economist. And the joke is when economists find complexity, they become like religious fanatics. They go to the opposite extreme. So Ralph now argues everything in humans is complex, nothing can be ordered. Yeah, that's Ralph's basic proposition, right? And I think he's fundamentally wrong. I think human beings have learned how to create order. But he will argue against that. And he also castigates anybody who disagrees with him as a systems thinker, which is crazy. If you look at the Rosacea matrix, which, by the way, he actually has said in writing he wishes he'd never created. Yeah? It's actually based on people's perception. It's not based on any reality. So it's a perceptual model, not an ontological model. Yeah? And one of the reasons I changed simple to obvious was partly to start to break that. Yeah? Aside from the fact that each domain you can be simple. Yeah, that was the other principle. And I keep thinking about changing some of the other domains as well.
Okay. Oh, no. Okay, Chris.
Which pub are we going to?
The Dirty Dick if we leave here. But I believe hospitality is open till 9, or do we need?
Yeah.
So we're not going to get kicked out in the short term, Chris. Okay.
So, thank you very much. I think that's really, really informative and interesting. And yeah, thank you very much.